What do you think of the report that says 62 people own more than the bottom half of the whole world's population? And we've been talking about this theory that the top 1% of the richest people now owns more wealth than the other 99% combined. Is it becoming true?
Well, thanks for having me, and I'd share just a few thoughts on this. One is, I'm a big fan of Oxfam and Winnie Byanyima, the leader. These are people who are drawing attention to extraordinary global challenges and really trying to give voice to people who don't get enough voice in the world. Second thing I'd say is that this inequality issue is real. It's felt, it's palpable around the world. But the third thing I would say is it's complicated. These numbers, I think we have to be careful not to fall into false precision. We have a pretty good sense of the billionaires. They have a huge amount of money, there's no question. But what does this really mean? If we think about how many people there are in the world, for example, roughly 40% of the world is under 25. These are the people without many assets to begin with. So why would we count them? We need to count apples to apples. I think if we think about someone like Bill Gates, who's an extraordinary, obviously wealthy man, worth about $80 billion, that's equivalent to about 80 million people if they each had $1,000 of savings per person. So that's a huge number. But how do we think about this? Well, Mr. Gates, of course, gives billions of dollars of philanthropy every year to help tackle global poverty. So I think we need to understand there's a real issue of inequality, but I think it's much more complicated than just looking at a handful of billionaires. I think we need to look at the millionaires. We need to look at who gets a chance to do well, and we need to look at comparing apples to apples across countries to see how this really is playing out. And the reality is we don't measure this very well yet.
Well, seem to have no dispute upon the inequality issue, but just how serious it is. So, Mr. Farnsworth, what's your opinion?
Well, I think this is exactly right. It is a serious issue, and it does have political implications. I think I would agree with your other guest. We do have to be a little bit careful how we measure this. And frankly, I'm not sure it's that useful to identify a specific number of people that have this or that amount of wealth, because that tends to demonize individuals, and I'm not sure that's a healthy contribution to the discussion. Having said that, I also think, and I completely agree, that it's appropriate to bring attention to some very difficult poverty issues globally. This is a critical point, and I think much more attention needs to be paid to that. But having said that, I think we're also neglecting some of the very real progress that's been made in poverty alleviation. If we focus on income inequality, we miss the gains that have been delivered to hundreds of millions of people worldwide over the past decade in emerging markets and the improvements in their lives. I think the real political question going forward, as the global economy seems to slow, as we have a continued technological transformation globally, as we have the question about what kind of jobs will be available going forward, and I know the Davos discussions are covering some of that, the real question going forward is, can these gains be sustained and maintained? The gains of people moving from poverty into a middle class. Are they secure in that middle class? Can they maintain those gains? Can they build on those gains for a better future for themselves and their family? I think that's fundamentally the political question.
But if we really take a look at those numbers, instead of talking about 62, the most richest 62, in 2010, Oxfam calculated it took 388 of those richest men made up to the bottom half of the wealth worldwide. So if we look at this number, we certainly agree that the income gap has been widening. So is it widening at a rapidly alarming pace? That's the question. Mr. Lee.
Yes, but we should be quite careful for the data we're using. But in fact, the inequality, both in globally and also in many countries, and also widening, that is very, very true. Yeah.
Yes, apart from alleviating those people out of poverty, we're certainly doing a good job on that. But having said that, the income distribution worldwide is completely in an issue that we should talk about. But if we look at this in a more global way, our two guests in Washington there have pointed out the complication of this issue. So tell us, what are the factors that are contributing to this income gap?
I think basically there are two factors. The first one is that if you look for the growth aspect, that some countries grow very fast, and many countries, particularly in the sub-Saharan African countries, and you know, very stagnated for decades. So that kind of a growth gap actually contributed, I think, significantly to this kind of equality in the one aspect. In another aspect, there's also distributional issues globally. Therefore, you know, we had just we just had new Millennium Development Goals. You know, we had completed Millennium Development Goals, and then we have reached for Sustainable Development Goals. This is the reason why we look at the kind of redistributional aspect. Those two aspects contributed to the inequality globally. Yeah.
Well, here in China, we often criticize developed countries for their inequality in social wealth. So, Mr. McArthur, what's the case in the U.S.? I've been reading reports saying that most of the problem resulted from the wealth accumulation, the capital accumulation between people. The poorest, they have only some savings, and they're not accumulated enough to pay their debts, to earn interest. But for the richest, they have a bunch of capitals that can accumulate and then generate a large amounts of wealth. Is that true?
Well, I just make a few points here. First, on the global distribution, when we look at people, if you were to line up all 7 billion people in a row, the rough distribution, colleague Branko Milanovic at the World Bank has looked at this quite carefully. It seems to be roughly steady in terms of the level of inequality because there are so many different types of progress. But the composition of where the money is across the 7 billion people is changing dramatically. And that is partly the huge success of Asia and other parts of the world, the incredible gains in extreme poverty, the incredible growth of the global middle class. But we're also seeing this second piece, which is the incredible concentration of growth of incomes and wealth. And we need to distinguish between income and wealth. Income is how much you make every year, roughly speaking. Wealth is how much you've got in the bank, roughly speaking. Those are two quite different things. And what we see in the US, for example, is that the gains in income of the entire economy over the past really roughly 5 to 10 years are extremely concentrated in the very, very wealthy. So the median worker isn't seeing much change in income for a couple generations. The highest income workers, the top 0.1%, the top 0.01%, they're seeing incredible gains on a pretty reliable basis. So this is part of the globalization of the world economy. If you're a Mark Zuckerberg and you come up with a great technology, you have billions of people you can reach. The flip side is, and I think the reason that there's so much political stress around the world in the US, in my home country of Canada, and other countries around the world, is it's a question of fairness, of who gets the chance to do well, and how does this affect our political system? If people feel that it's only the wealthy who are getting access to political decision making, they get quite upset. And I think that's a lot of this kernel of distrust that we're seeing around the world. Is it's not just about income, it's about access and fairness to influence.
Well, Zuckerberg is justified because he has created a lot of opportunities for those developing economy people. Mr. Farnsworth, so what region, or is it developing countries or is it developed countries that suffer the most from this income inequality or the wealth inequality?
Well, I think it's a question of how you define suffer, really. You know, I think at least in my country, in the US, I don't think people begrudge rich people or, frankly, the opportunity to get wealthy. In fact, many people in the United States and globally want to be wealthy, so they don't see any particular harm in that. I think that the question is one of fairness that your previous guest just raised, and I think that's absolutely right. And that issue of fairness has completely infused the ongoing presidential discussions here in the United States leading toward our elections in November. The Democratic Party, this is one of the fundamental issues that they're discussing right now among all three leading candidates, and particularly the top two leading candidates, but it also affects the Republican side and the question of who is in control, who is determining outcomes, who has created a system that only favors certain groups of people, in this case that we're talking about, perhaps the wealthy or others. And so you get questions about banking and questions about taxation policies and things like this. But I think the political question, at least in some of the developed markets, is not necessarily whether it's appropriate to get rich. I think the question is fairness and who has the opportunity to actually get to that point.
What's obvious here in China is the gap is becoming ever greater since 30 years ago when we reform and open up. So tell us some of the reasons here in China that we're seeing this inequality.
And it's actually some people said, well, and China's inequality has reached to a 0.5, and when the country actually reached to 0.4, it is quite a critical threshold. Then you have a lot of, you have really significant social unrest and even many social problems. But in fact, and as I always argue with that kind of data, so we be very careful with data because how you calculate it and always what kind of base you use and what kind of database you use, this is always a problem. But in fact, it is very true that inequality has really been the problem in China. And there are two aspects here in China. The one is for the income disparity. You see the very big difference among different groups and money, monthly, yearly. And then secondly, you look for the redistribution issues, particularly looking for the welfare distributions. And some people get very good social services, and some people are not very good social services. So this kind of two directions interacted together, contributed strongly to the inequality, what I call this overall social inequality. So that is a big problem today, we face in China. And that is also part of the reason why we actually take very serious emphasis on the poverty issues currently. And the Chinese government actually looking for how to use the rest 5 years, even very short time, very short period of time, to use 5 years to solve this problem of poverty. And that is that's a really critical reason why we have to really get this kind of poverty off. Otherwise, increasing the social, increasing the inequality, and it gives problem for growth. That's all interlinked reasons and interlinked the factors and affected the overall growth and the development of China, and eventually contribute whether China could reach the sustainable development in the future or not. Yeah.